Awareness of self. As understood thus far, there is a difference in quality between the state of self-remembering and an act of self-remembering, many degrees of, or levels of quality between acts of self-remembering. Yet the least of these is greater than, on a level above, the fullest self-observation. The act of self-remembering is a conscious effort made in order to remember oneself. The state of self-remembering, on the other hand, is a result of the act, and the quality of the state of self-remembering depends upon the quality of the act, the quality of effort made to remember oneself. The act of taking a guitar, for example, then striking chords on it, is different from the state of being able to play music on a guitar. We have to make an effort to take the guitar and play on it before we are able to reach the state of being able to produce music. Then there are degrees of difference between playing a simple tune and being a virtuoso. If I want to behave better, or have better manners, then the act of trying to is not the same as being in the state of having better behavior and manners. If I make the right effort, then I might reach the state that I wish to attain, and the result will be in accordance with the quality of my effort. The act of trying to remember myself is to endeavor through trial and failure to reach some new state of oneself called the state of self-remembering. If I already know how to reach that state, then the act or effort that I make will put me into the state. However, I cannot expect at first, by performing the act of self-remembering, to reach that state. It will only be through long work, by innumerable acts, that I gain any success in reaching the state that I am striving for. Taking then the second parts of the statement in which it is said, there can be no progress unless and until someone remembers themselves. It would be best to confirm here that unless an individual can lift themselves up through self-remembering, they do not receive help, and that unless that individual receives help, then they cannot reach an elevated level of being. At the same time, unless we prepare ourselves by means of self-observation, by trying to separate from what the work teaches are wrong functions, we cannot receive the influences coming from higher centers. We have to prepare our lower centers, so they can hear the inner voices of higher centers, which are always speaking to us and always trying to change us, but which we cannot hear. In praise of our generous spirit, in friendship and as light grows, for all things are in this fire of many voices where men have found their strength. Rig Veda 1, Descent. This does not mean that higher centers are trying to change or alter our being, because they are neutral, not violent and accusatory. We feel the absence of higher centers as a general feeling of discomfort, as if we had forgotten something once known. Unless lower centers can begin to hear higher centers, there is no possibility of help with evolution. We are created as self-developing organisms, however, must receive help from esoteric teaching in order to evolve. We are disconnected from real I, which belongs to higher centers, and can transmit meaning to us. Real I understands the language of higher centers, however, false I does not. Real I is what we are, and why we exist, or rather why we exist is to come into contact with real I. In one of the esoteric writings of India, it is said, if one fails to reach God, they are continually reborn into existence. And so we go around and around in the cycle of possible births and recurrence, until we understand why we exist. Everyone has real I in them, but at a higher and much deeper level than that from which we ordinarily live or think and feel. Everyone is created with the possibility of making contact with that real I, of which they are nothing but a foolish reflection or imitation, an avatar and caricature at best. Everyone has an eternal center of gravity, however, being swayed by their senses, by the feeling that they are nothing but their bodies, by the impact of impressions coming from external subjective life, they are led astray, and far from this center of gravity. Self-remembering is the beginning of an attempt to bring us back into ourselves, and so into a real center of gravity. That is why a very external or material individual, that is simply governed by the effect they make on other people, has great difficulty in understanding what self-remembering means, and indeed what this work is all about. Gurdjieff once said, behind real I lies our Creator. However, the beginning of all this, going back to our real origin, starts with observing I. Which means, of course, that it starts with the work itself, for observing I must know about what to observe, then to do this from what the work teaches. If we use the wrong mirror, the wrong observing eye, and perhaps some social eye, then it is not in a work sense an observing eye. However, if we can establish in ourselves some point of observation, from what we understand of what the work teaches us to observe, then we are on the first rung of the ladder that reaches ultimately to real eye. Many assume that it is easy to establish observing eye in a real work sense. It is, however, a difficult struggle, and requires great effort, a great deal of inner sincerity, and a wealth of failure. Once that observing eye is established, it collects other eyes around it that wish to work, that wish to understand better, and a desire to find the secret to their existence. Everyone really has this secret feeling about themselves, but they do not put it into operation because they don't really know what to do. And so it becomes a source of negative emotion. Where deputy steward is formed, it may attract steward, and then finally real eye. But these are words of great density of meaning, as to understand anything of Jacob's ladder takes a long time and deep reflection. It needs a great deal of thinking about what this work means, then rethinking, and seeing the state of one's own being, a little later re-seeing it again. This demands a great deal of inner realization, of continual access and valuation, an ongoing renewal of that valuation, and reformation of what we understand, in order to see where one is and what they are. Anyone following the path of this work, having understood that it is not something on the blackboard, will find that even the simplest sayings of the work transform themselves into deeper layers or levels of meaning, much like an onion. This work and all of its brief formulations could only come from a source that knows and understands far more than we do. Yet the least of these acts of self-remembering is greater than, or on a level above, the fullest self-observation. This quote means, to begin with, that an act of self-remembering is greater than an act of self-observation. The reference to fullest self-observation is beside the point. Full self-observation can only come about with an enormous increase of consciousness, and in that sense would be the same as an increased consciousness of the state of self-remembering, self-awareness, or self-consciousness. To be fully aware of oneself would correspond to a third state of consciousness. An act of self-remembering for us, such as we are, is but a faint glimmer. An act of self-observation may be more distinct, as the two are not on the same level. A state of full self-observation would belong to the level above us, to a four-dimensional being, or a Time Lord, someone with the ability to perceive all times anywhere, and with that, each instance of every occurrence. The outcome of every enactment, of all possible choices in any circumstance. We cannot at our level of consciousness expect to observe everything fully in ourselves, let alone outside of us. How could we, for example, fully observe the whole of our lives, altogether? How could we observe at our level of consciousness all that is going on in every part of a center? We know there are stories of people who, through near-death experience, recall the whole of their lives. At point of death, an individual may pass into a different state of consciousness and an increased state of awareness. In the terms of this work, we would call that a third state of consciousness, the state of self-remembering, self-consciousness or self-awareness, and awareness of self. Then, undoubtedly, an individual would sense full observation of themselves in a way they had never dreamed possible. However, such as we are, self-observation is a very small thing, but nonetheless essential, like carrying a tiny LED light through a big dark house and seeing one thing after another. After a time, memory, that is, work memory or memory created through conscious effort in self-observation, we may begin to connect all those separate little flashes and epiphanies into something bigger. This means that someone begins to take photographs of themselves, they begin to observe themselves over a period of time, but altogether this time as one experience. From that moment on, they can begin to catch a glimpse of their chief feature. They can observe strands running through their lives and therefore patterns in the fabric of their life. In the three definitions of the third state of consciousness, the term self-awareness connects with full self-observation. If someone at their present level of consciousness had a moment of full observation, they would probably lose their grip on reality, because it would mean that they sensed all the inner contradictions within themselves. To reach such an insight requires long work, and the work would never allow an individual to see more than they can stand. We all make the mistake of thinking we can attain a higher degree of consciousness at the press of a button, or just because we want it. Consider how long it took to learn to read or write, how many years it takes to really read and to really understand, then write what can inspire or touch others. One hears the work for a long time, just as a child sees their letters for a long time, but it takes several years before we can really speak or write. Remember too that suddenly a child finds it can read, just in this same way with the work. Suddenly we find we can understand something we have heard or spoken out loud many times. This means we are ready for it, and we have earned it. All work on self below that level is preparatory to progress towards consciousness. Further, we can protect ourselves psychologically only through self-remembering. To be protected psychologically from the external drama of life, we must remember ourselves. This means that one must find something to take the place of identifying with all that goes on in our daily lives. If you take life as the whole business, thinking that you are nothing but your body, you will not be able to remember yourself. If you think your eyes see, and not that something sees through them, you will not be able to remember yourself. If you think that everything you do and feel or think belongs to your body, you will not be able to remember yourself. You will become instead like religious followers, who think that heaven is something above, and hell somewhere below them, failing to understand that heaven and hell are within us all. If we take as reality the messages coming from our external senses, then we will think that reality is something existing far away in the visible stars. We will fail to comprehend that it exists within us, at a deeper level of our understanding. A level we can only reach through understanding everything that this work tells us about separating ourselves from wrong activities going on mechanically each day. The things that keep us glued to the most external, most superficial sides of ourselves. Those sides that are governed by everything that happens outside of us. Things that depend for their well-being on how people react toward us. This is inevitable, as long as we have no inner behavior that we are following. The work is about this inner behavior, which gives us a center of gravity, independent of external things. If we think we are the same as our bodies, that our eyes see and our ears hear, if we have no sense that it is we who see through our eyes, and we who hear through our ears, that there is something different in us from our physical senses, something higher, then we will not be able to remember ourselves. If we are naturalists, who believe only in the reality that their senses reveal, who believe that the natural world with all of its events are the cause of everything, then we will never be able to remember ourselves, nor will we be able to understand the ray of creation, and a side octave from the sun. We will never be able to understand that influences are acting upon this planet Earth of ours, coming from a higher level, and acting on our being as well. That we receive these influences according to the quality of our being,